Hello everyone, my name is Sean, and the title of my research is The Sacred Revolution, Propaganda and Personality Cult in North Korea. So for my research, my question was, how has North Korea lasted for as long as it has? 30 years have passed since the Soviet Union collapsed, and while China, Vietnam, and Eastern Europe have integrated themselves into the global economy, North Korea still remains largely and fiercely resistant to it. Typically, widespread destitution and political repression lead to liberal reforms or a democratic revolution, and yet neither of these things have happened in North Korea. So this begs the question as to what is the regime doing to so effectively maintain control internally? One possible explanation is the security apparatus, the secret police, the mass surveillance, the concentration camps. All these things contribute to the political status quo. But what about the role of culture? Is it possible that there are certain customs and norms that perpetuate the oppression of a people, while also protecting the power and privilege of a dominant group, all without using violence? My answer to this question is yes. Now, culture is a big umbrella term, so I'm only going to focus on one aspect of the culture that I believe is having the most impact. I argue that the personality cult of the Kim dynasty functions like a state religion that manufactures the consent of the governed. Now, religion means many things to many people, but the way how the sociologist Emil Durkheim defined it is as a set of beliefs and practices that are sacred and form a community. When something is sacred, it means that it is elevated in that society, it is protected from criticism, and it is adhered to with intensity. In addition to Durkheim, I also used Clifford Geertz's thick description to interpret North Korean culture, as well as Irving Goffman's dramaturgical analysis to analyze social interaction. So for my sources of evidence, other than looking at historians, anthropologists, and political scientists, I also looked at the lived experiences of North Korean defectors. I looked at the myths and rituals of the North Korean state religion. When I say something is a myth, I don't necessarily mean that it's a falsehood. It's basically a didactic belief or story, something that has moral instruction to it, but doesn't contain evidence. I also looked at the propaganda of North Korea. And when I say propaganda, I don't just mean a textbook or a website or a newspaper that contains distorted or biased information. I would argue that even art is a form of propaganda, because all art is promoting some sort of viewpoint. According to the Catholic author Karen Armstrong, modern art, literature, music, and film are the spiritual successors of religion from antiquity. They answer the same questions, they give guidance to our lives, and they regulate our emotions. Thus, recognizing the power of faith, the need to believe and the need to belong, and the power of emotive storytelling in art, the North Korean regime synthesized these things to create a monolithic ideological system that will win the hearts and minds of its people. In virtually every religion, there is a central figure who promoted a lifestyle or a dogma that was meant to be believed and practiced by others. In North Korea, this story is called the Revolution, and the main character is Kim Il-sung, the founding father of the country who ruled it for almost half a century. He was born during a time of great national sorrow and humiliation, when Japan occupied Korea in the early 20th century. Now, he is more than just a national hero to North Korean people. He was a messianic figure who brought salvation and redemption to his people in the Holy Motherland. This is because North Korean propagandists constructed a biography about Kim Il-sung that bears tremendous resemblance to religious narratives. It shares a literary structure that the mythologist Joseph Campbell called the hero's journey, and is divided in 3 phases. The first phase is called the departure. This is when the hero is separated from the homeland and receives a call to adventure. In Kim Il-sung's case, this is when he allegedly discovers the oppression of his people when he's 13, and he decides to leave Korea for China to liberate his country. The second phase is called the initiation, when the hero undergoes a series of trials in order to obtain their goal. In Kim Il-sung's case, this is when he makes his conversion to communism in China, joins the Communist Party there, and engages in anti-Japanese guerrilla warfare in the 1930s. Then the final stage is called return, when the redeemed and enlightened hero brings back their new knowledge or treasure back to the homeland. In North Korean mythology, Kim Il-sung single-handedly liberated the entire peninsula without the help of the Soviets, the Americans, or the Chinese. Obviously, it was not like that. After World War II, after Japan was defeated, the Soviets and the Americans create two separate governments. In the North, in the summer of 1950, invades the South to force reunification. If you were in North Korea, however, you would be taught that the US imperialists and the South Korean puppets invaded the North to colonize it. Now, a lot of the myths and propaganda in North Korea about the Korean War are either exaggerated or just outright fabricated, but they don't necessarily need to lie about everything. 75% of North Korean cities were bombed by the United States during the Korean War, forcing people to live underground or in caves. Dams were also destroyed, inundating crops, flooding villages, putting people on the brink of starvation. All in all, the North suffered about 2 million casualties, the majority in the war. I say these things not to apologize for the North Korean regime, but to show what and why North Koreans believe what they believe. Because a majority of North Koreans do buy into the anti-American propaganda, because the historical evidence makes it more compelling. And the purpose of all these myths is threefold. For one, it tries to instill in North Koreans a victim consciousness, but it also tries to instill a cardinal doctrine in the state religion, a Manichaean worldview of good versus evil, oppressor versus oppressed, where North Koreans are these morally pure, innocent victims of American aggression, and Americans themselves are these diabolical, monolithic other with no complexity to them. This in turn inspires fear and mistrust of the outsider, but trust and acquiescence towards the insider. So despite all its brutality, North Koreans are willing to believe or support or at least tolerate the North Korean regime because they think Americans are so much worse. The devil you know is better than the one you don't. So in addition to literature, music is also a source of various myths and doctrines. This popular children's song, for example, tries to teach North Korean children to express filial piety towards the fatherly leader. But music is not just a source of myth, it's also a source of ritual. Music is a performative activity that teaches discipline, conformity, and routine. Building on this idea of performance, you could argue that all of North Korean public life is a performance. This regime, needless to say, is very theatrical. When you see mass dancing, gymnastics, card stunts, or national parades, these are trying to embody and internalize in the believer the totalitarian ideal of single-minded unity, oneness with the Father, the supreme leader. But other than an ideological purpose, these rituals, these performances, they serve a psychological purpose. When we're in a football game, a political convention, or a house of worship, or a music concert, there's an electricity that goes through the crowd, a kind of where people lose themselves, but become one with something larger and indescribable. This is what the sociologist Durkheim called collective effervescence, and it's one of the psychological feelings that the North Korean regime is trying to elicit in these rituals. And the impact is that people genuinely enjoy these things, according to North Korean defectors. This whole idea of people just bonding together, surrendering and sacrificing themselves for something that could outlive them, right? This is one of the few things that North Korean defectors actually kind of miss about North Korea. So in conclusion, how effective are all these various sources of propaganda? It's difficult to say because we can't empirically verify what North Koreans really believe. But based on defector testimonies, in general, the propaganda is declining in its effect. Ever since the 1990s, when a massive famine occurred, killing up to 1 million people at the beginning of Kim Jong-il's dictatorship after his father died. A lot of North Koreans have lost faith in the regime, or at least become skeptical of it. And because the socialist system can no longer provide food for the people, now North Koreans have reinvented capitalism. Now they're smuggling in goods from China, not just food, but also television, USB drives, CDs, DVDs, containing South Korean music, American films. Clothing and makeup as well is also being smuggled in. And the result of all these different products is that North Koreans are being exposed to the outside world like never before for the past 30 years. And they're being given new opportunities to channel their subjectivity, to express their individuality in ways that are not political, ways that are not collective, in ways that are not about just loving the regime or the Kim family, but about loving each other or loving yourself. With all that being said, there's still a lot of nostalgia for Kim Il-sung in North Korea because of his charismatic leadership and because of the economic prosperity and stability under his decades-long dictatorship. So if North Korea were to be invaded by the United States or South Korea, according to defector Yoon Jung, pictured here, North Koreans, hundreds of thousands of them, would lay down their lives for the regime, their supreme leader, and their families. So if a war is not going to peacefully solve the situation, and since sanctions don't seem to be really working either, they affect the wrong people, and they just inspire even more resentment towards the United States, the only people who can really change North Korea are North Korean people themselves. Ideally, if we empower them with even more knowledge about the outside world, they're going to become fully aware of their oppression eventually, and then they will rise up against the regime. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. I'd like to thank all these people for all their help, and thank you for listening.